So now we will move to English. So first of all, I would like to thank the Institute of Investigaciones Jurídicas de la UNAM y la Coordinación del Posgrado and their directors, Pedro Salazar and Carlos Reyes, for the support to this workshop. I want to welcome our international scholars, John Ferjon, Tom Ginsberg, Pasquale Pasquino, and Zachary Elkins. It is really wonderful to have you here. And many thanks to Chisca Poe, Hector Fix, Alberto Simser, Hugo Concha, and Pauline Capdeville for participating in this workshop. I want to thank also Mariana Trujillo, Alejandro Ramirez, and Jaime Heredia for their collaboration, and Maria Jose Franco on the organization of this event. And finally, and last but not least, thank you to all of you for coming. So the general question behind the workshop is how patterns of constitutional reform affect constitutions and their efficacy. We will focus on the case of Mexico that, as you all know, is characterized by a pattern of constitutional hiper-reformism, by which I just simply mean the pattern of constant reforms that had led to more than 600 reforms. Hiper-reformism in Mexico has been linked to several constitutional inefficacies. For example, the ones produced by textual incoherence and those linked to the epistemic incapacities to know and apprehend a constantly changing and growing text, both by authorities and by citizens. The fact that, against all expectations, Mexico didn't change this pattern after the transition to democracy is even more puzzling. What are exactly the types of inefficacies that are linked to hiper-reformism in Mexico, and how can we account for the pattern itself, and also how can we face and respond to these problems of inefficacy? So here we will discuss the causes, the causes and consequences of this hiper-reformism, and we will also discuss a project of constitutional reorganization and consolidation that aims to attenuate some of the negative effects of hyper-reformism. To start our discussion, we'll discuss two papers that will give us a comparative perspective, and then we will move to the case of Mexico and focus on it. So we will start with Professor Ginsberg's paper. You can have like a 5-minute or 2 minutes break just that he can plug in and his presentation, and we will start right away.
Too long. Let's see how the technology gods are friendly. Okay. I guess I need help. I don't know. Oh, hi. How are you? Good. I don't know if, there. Up here. Buonissimo. All right, shall I start? Do we need a gong, or should I wait for Andrea? It's 2 minutes past, so I better start. All right, thank you all for being here. Thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be in Mexico City. It's one of my favorite places, and I should come much more often. So this is a paper, a global paper really, about amendment and amendment difficulty, and it responds to a kind of theme in the academic literature, but also a very real-world problem. The academic literature is that we've been wrestling with amendment difficulty, the concept of amendment difficulty, for several decades. Actually, John Farragon has a nice piece on this in Law and Social Inquiry from the 90s. And I think one thing the paper tries to do is make an advance on that existing measurement problem. How do we conceptualize amendment difficulty and how do we measure it? That's a kind of academic question. The practical problem is the one that is faced in countries, of which there are many at any one time, that are drafting a new constitution. And they face the problem of having to pick an amendment rule. And they do so on a kind of basis, we'd say it's an armchair kind of basis. They don't really have much knowledge to deploy in trying to write an amendment rule. And so it tends to be a sort of poorly organized thing. You'll have an advisor come in and say, oh, in the United States, we do it this way, you should do it this way. Or, you know, our colonial power was Portugal, so we're going to use the Portuguese system. Well, that's not a very logical way. So what we're trying to do is push to see whether we can say anything to the people who have the very real concrete problem of drafting an amendment rule in a constitutional scheme. Because just doing nothing is doing something, as we learn in Syria with so. All right. Now, I start the paper by the literature, which John has contributed to, and others, often will start with a statement. The United States Constitution is the world's most difficult to amend because, you know, it's 2/3 of 2 houses of Congress, a president, and then 3/4 of the states. But the question is why? How do we really know that? How can we even say that that is a more difficult procedure than a country that has, let's say, 2/3 of the legislature and a referendum, or an intervening election between the proposal and approval? And there's lots of variations in these institutional designs, and that we face the problem of comparing, commensurability across them. Furthermore, in some sense, we would only be able to make a statement about the institutions if we could observe the demand. If we could say demand for amendment is the same in these 5 different countries, and the institutions are different, then we would be able to say something about which institutions facilitate amendment. But demand for amendment is unobservable, although I'd be interested in ideas about how we might push forward on this paper to try to get inference about that. Generally speaking, we can't see the demand for constitutional amendment. And this makes it very difficult. Plus, as I said before, there are these various different dimensions of designs. Some countries, like the United States, have 2 alternative procedures. We've only used one of them, but how do you think about that other one in terms of weighting when we say, well, the Constitution has this level of amendment difficulty? Some countries have these provisions that can never be amended. So in Germany, the basic structure and the fundamental rights. Actually, John Farragon and I met in Mongolia, I think, many years ago, and working on the Mongolian constitution in the early 1990s. And towards the end of his life, the founder, the drafter of the Mongolian constitution, got worried that his handiwork would be changed. And so he engineered the passage of a law which purported to prohibit constitutional amendment. Just an ordinary law. But it's got like 1/3 of the entire Constitution is now unamendable by statute. Well, that's weird because obviously you can just pass a new statute. Nevertheless, it's sort of like British style. It's politically entrenched maybe. And so the whole point is it's very complicated to measure these things cross-nationally. Despite that, we try. This figure from the paper shows that amendment seems to be coming more frequently. More countries are amending more of the time. Maybe this is because social and political change is happening more rapidly. The institutional structures aren't working anymore, but there's a real increase in constitutional amendments beginning in 1950, far outstripping the number of new constitutions, which is the panel on the left. All right, so the paper is really not really a law paper as so much as a technical paper about measurement. And so we go through all the different other scholars who've worked on it. And for this presentation, I'm not going to go through all the details. But basically, people trying to measure amendment difficulty or amendment rate, the rate of change, when we talk about hyper-reformism in Mexico, we have to make some measurement choices. For example, is the amendment rate the number of amendments that pass the Congress, the number of provisions that are amended, or as Zachary Elkins and I say in our measurement, just the number of years in which a constitution was amended. That's what we call an amendment year. Because the idea is that the political coalition, once you mobilize it, the number of times they decide to say yes is immaterial, and we choose the year as the unit of analysis. So the point is that we are making a choice, and that might affect our findings. In thinking about the amendment rate, there seem to be two different kinds of measures. One is what we call ordinal measures, which means the scholar will say amendment difficulty can range from 1, 2, 3, and 4. And 1 is just simple ordinary majority, 2 is a two-thirds majority, 3 is majority and signature. They would assign different values to these boxes, and we put the rates, and we can compare them that way. And that's the approach of the classic paper in this area from the 1990s, the one that John responded to, and then later in the 1990s. And many scholars take that approach. Another way to get at the amendment rate, or the amendment difficulty, the measure of amendment difficulty, is to develop what we're calling an endogenous measure, a measure which uses the observed rate of change, the observed amendment rate, to try to back out of that some sense of institutional difficulty. So that's what the classic paper did using American states. I have to say, as a side comment, I don't think American state constitutions are actually constitutions in the same sense that we are talking about them. And Mexican state constitutions, similarly, I think we should think about them as sub-constitutions, somewhere in between. And so I'm very reluctant to use their experience as the basis for a cross-national indicator. Another scholar uses the same approach using national constitutions, and what Zach and I do with James Melton is to basically use the existing rate of amendment, controlling for all the factors that we predict will generate constitutional change. And this is from our book on the endurance of national constitutions. So we have a big model predicting when constitutions will die and when they will change. And what we do is we put in variables for each of the institutional possibilities into that equation. So you would have a dummy variable saying, parliamentary supermajority, or a dummy variable for presidential approval. And we put that all in the same analysis, and that generates globally sort of coefficients for each of those institutional features. And then when we go look at a particular country and we look at their rule, we can kind of give them an estimated measure using those coefficients, if that makes sense. So it's a little technical. I'm happy to go through it if it's helpful. The big point is that we're using the observed rate of amendment to generate the measure of difficulty. And so that's endogenous, and that creates endogeneity problems and such. Now, when in the paper we look at the correlations among all these different scholars, and it turns out that just the correlations of the different measures are really, really low, and in some cases negative. That means different scholars trying to measure the same concept are not coming up with measures that look alike, that they're very different. And that leads us to suggest that maybe none of them are valid measures, that they're not actually getting at what they're trying to get at. And so it's a bit of a mess. Frankly, the field is a bit of a mess and hasn't really gone that far from Donald Lutz, who started it. Now, controversial part of our paper is that we say there may be something that is driving amendments that has nothing to do with institutions. And indeed, that's our core finding. I mean, our core finding is that institutional structures do not predict amendments, observed rates of amendments in national constitutions. And that's an important finding for the practical side. We'll see if it holds up on the scholarly side. But then what is it that's driving amendment? And one of our suggestions is that there may be something in people's attitudes. This is the demand, that there's sort of a baseline level of demand within the political system for constitutional amendment. And that we're calling it amendment culture, but that it would be is sort of independent of the substantive issue that you're talking about, and the degree of pressure for change. There's a kind of attitude about constitutional amendment. That's what we're trying to talk about here. And the theory is that, if you could observe it, even under the same institutional arrangements, differences in amendment culture would lead to different amendment rates. And so it matters. That's basically the argument. All right, so let's see. So now, what do? We do something very novel in our own measurement in this paper. which is rather than just simply use the number of changes in a constitutional text, the hyper-reformism, just the number of instances of amendment or the number of years. We actually try to, for the first time in this literature, get at the degree of change that the amendments are working. Zach and I, in our book, point out that most constitutional amendments are very, very minor. They're not changing a lot of things. They're not changing important things. And so, something like a third of all amendments would not even show up in our own large survey of constitutional institutions. We have a large database of constitutional institutions since 1789 for all countries. Many amendments wouldn't even register on our list of 600 different topics, 666 topics. So that means they're doing very minor things that don't affect the core of the Constitution. But no one has yet sort of looked at the degree of change. And if you think about it, if we're to move towards a normative theory of a good amendment mechanism, right? Amendment rule, ultimately, we should be using the social science. We'd like to use it to say something normative. And if we're going to get to that point, then we have to take into account the type of change, the degree of change. And so we introduced this idea of a weighted amendment measure, which is basically the sum total of all changes in a constitutional system. You compare Mexico's 1917 Constitution with the Constitution today, and you look at the substance of them, and you see, take all of that changes and divide it over the number of years that the Constitution's been alive. And this gives you a sense of the amount of change per year. And that's the thing we come up with in this paper. So that's what we're trying to get at. And we use that and the more simple amendment rate that we developed in the earlier work and try to see whether institutions affect the amendment rate and how much. I'm going to go a little further here. All right, so what we do is we have measures of, so in our trying to explain this dependent variable, either the real weighted, the regular amendment rate or the weighted version, we have these models which include crucial independent variables. One of them is a set of variables that have to do with amendment difficulty, the institutional structures, who can propose, how many actors need to approve a constitutional amendment, the threshold in the legislature, etc. One set of variables deal with what we're calling amendment culture, and here we have the big problem in measurement. How do you really measure people's attitudes about constitutional change? It would be nice if we could go out and survey everybody in the world and say, what do you think about constitutional change? No one's done that. We didn't really have the money to do it. What we use here is basically the lagged dependent variable. We use the rate of change in the previous constitutional system in the country's history. Most countries are like Mexico and not like the United States, right? They have multiple constitutions in their history. And the idea is that whatever the amendment rate was in the last one might be a factor in the amendment rate in the next constitution. Now, crucially, that is, we're not simply saying that we're not looking just at country characteristics, right? Although, a country might have a consistent amendment culture, it doesn't need to. This variable can change. If a country has 10 constitutional systems, we're only looking at the last one. And that's probably controversial, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. But it seems to be good because we don't want a notion of culture which is fixed and unvarying. That's why social scientists never use culture. So we're trying to be somewhat flexible there. We control for time. We control for the level of number of words in the Constitution. Mexico's Constitution is already so long, it invites more amendments, is our finding, generally. And we also control for region, because in the work that Zach and I have done, we find in general region is a really powerful predictor of lots of different things in the text and outside it. So that's what we do. And basically our finding, and I won't go through the numbers, is whether we just look at democracies or autocracies, whether we look at the ordinary amendment rate or the weighted one, this culture variable is a much stronger predictor than the institutional ones. Okay? So that's interesting. It suggests that no matter what amendment rule you adopt in a new constitution, your recent history is going to be very important in terms of your net amendment rate that we're going to observe. And that's important for institutional designers. Now, in some of the specifications, we have some weak results that are consistent with an institutional theory. As I said before, longer, more detailed constitutions like Mexico tend to generate more amendment. They're what we call statutory constitutions in some sense, and Hector will talk about this later. There's all kinds of stuff in there that might not necessarily need to be in the Constitution. But once you have it in there, then you have to amend it all the time, as you do with ordinary law. And so, of course, we see a higher amendment rate. We also find in one specification that more approvers involved lead to less amendment, I think, is the result. So that means, I think that's right, I have to check that. But in any case, that's a kind of consistent with what you would think. But the basic result is that there is serial continuity. There are path dependencies with regard to the amendment rate we are likely to observe in a new constitution. Now, what do we want to do with that? I think I just want to close by saying a word about the normative project. You know, it's hard to take this and go to a country, you know, like Nepal, which has just passed a new constitution, and say this is what you should do or shouldn't do. In general, when I engage with people who are writing constitutions, my general intuition is that they should keep things flexible. The idea that, you know, things should be rigid is kind of intuitive in the notion of a constitution, but it's so hard to mobilize a political coalition in many countries that even a 60% threshold really means that it will never be amended. And so that's always been my intuition, but I'm not sure that that really holds up after this evidence, right? It's basically, we can't say much about it except to look at your own history, and perhaps at the margin you can change things, you know, knowing what your demand, your cultural demand for amendment is. But there's lots of problems in drawing causal inferences here, as I'm sure Alberto will tell me. The other normative point, I think, is that when you think about it from the point of view of democratic theory, even our weighting about the amount of change isn't really normative. You know, we're just measuring the amount of change. You can't say if those are good changes or bad changes. So I think what I'd like to do, actually, is to have a measure where we define a kind of democratic core of the Constitution. Rights provisions, I don't know, maybe put term limits or elections, things like that in there, and say that when those things change, those are the things we're interested in, and we're all interested in whether they're being changed in a regressive or progressive way. And that, I think, if we could do that and have a statistical model that predicted it, then we'd be able to say something normative from the positive social science. We're not there yet. And with that, I'll stop.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to Andrea and everybody else here at the Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas. I am by training a political scientist who concerns himself with political economy. So I am no expert on constitutions. But as a social scientist, I have some comments on Tom's paper that I would like to share. So first of all, I want to say this paper was very interesting for me to read. It was for me a crash course on constitutional amendment and on the state of the art in their empirical study, because the paper also reviews prior work. I think it does an admirable job of laying out the issues and the empirical challenges in a very clear and systematic manner. Another virtue of the paper is that the questions it raises really open not one but probably a few research agendas that would all require substantial further empirical work and some theoretical work as well. One of those would be to code, of course, the content of the amendments in some normative fashion, like Tom just suggested. The paper improves on past work in two ways. First, it tries to address some of the empirical problems in past studies, and it has much better data than was available before the Comparative Constitutions Project was created. And second, it lays out what I take to be a new hypothesis, which is this idea of the constitutional amendment culture, which refers to norms, beliefs about constitutional amendments, their desirability, etc. This hypothesis, I would like to point out, is clearly amenable to further refinement and to further empirical research. So I think that's and I think myself working on culture in other realms, and having had some conversations with Tom previously in prior joint work about culture and authoritarian constitutions, I heartily support this kind of avenue for research. I have a couple of, I have a couple of comments that I would like to make now in terms of how I think the paper could be pushed forward. The first, I want to talk a little bit about amendment difficulty. And again, not being an expert in this, I have the advantage of coming to it with a fresh eye, but also the disadvantage that maybe all of this has been said before. But my view on is the first thing I want to talk about is this measurement of amendment difficulty, this concept of how difficult is it to amend a constitution. As the authors readily acknowledge, knowing the rules, the formal rules say, do I need 2/3 of the legislature, or do I need, as in some cases, 2 elections, 2 governments? So an amendment is proposed in one government, then there has to be an election, and the amendment can only be approved by the next government. Or having more veto players, etc. Knowing these rules is not enough to know amendment difficulty. The question really is, I think this is the way I would frame it, in expectation. What proportion of the time is a particular rule likely to be a constraint? Right? And when is a rule likely to be a constraint? Well, for example, if you go to Sweden and the party in government controls, stays in power for decades and controls most of the legislature, then having maybe a 2/3 amendment rule, 2/3 of the legislature rule, is never binding in a very long period of time. So therefore, in Sweden at that time, the rule is not binding. So the question really is, you can't just look at the rule, you have to form a conjecture about all the other circumstances, about the political configurations that will render the rule a binding veto point or not. Now, how do you do that? Well, if I were predicting for the United States, for example, and I know that if I knew, just for example, that you needed 3/4 majority in the legislature, in one of the chambers or both, to pass a constitutional amendment, then maybe what I could do is look at U.S. history or recent U.S. history, or just weight recent U.S. history more heavily than past U.S. history, and say, well, how often has this kind of political configuration happened? And if the answer is never, then I have a very good sense that this rule in the United States is likely to be a binding constraint, and therefore amendment difficulty is very high. So the way that I would think about it is, in addition to looking at the rules, which all of these measures do, you have to make a conjecture about the likely political scenarios, likely states of the world, and then in expectation, you can estimate the likelihood that an amendment might be passed. Now, making that conjecture, of course, means making more assumptions. But I think they could be informed assumptions. They could be informed by whatever is known about the country and its likely political configurations. I think that would be an imperfect way to talk about amendment difficulty, but I think it would be far superior to the way that it's done now, because right now, countries are so heterogeneous in terms of political configurations that a given rule means something totally different in one context and another. Okay. So this could actually be done, and in fact, once you come up with these kinds of parameter estimates, you could run even a simulation study to try to predict at different points in time what would be amendment difficulty based on the information available up to that time about political configurations and about rules. Okay, so the second issue I want to talk about, also discussed at length in the paper, and it's a very thorny issue as well, is the issue, this one is even more difficult, I believe, is the issue of demand for amendments. So even if I knew exactly how difficult it would be to pass an amendment if somebody proposed it, the likelihood that an amendment will take place, which is the dependent variable here, what we want to predict, also depends on somebody wanting to amend, to propose an amendment. And so the rate of amendments is going to be jointly determined by those two things. Now, the demand for amendments is incredibly difficult to estimate, right? I mean, one could, for example, look at proposed amendments that passed and didn't pass. Okay, maybe that's a step forward, but that has the huge problem that, the likelihood that an amendment will pass is a factor that helps to determine whether somebody will actually propose an amendment in the first place. In other words, proposing amendments many times will be off the path of play. That doesn't mean there is no demand for them. So I think that's an incredibly difficult problem. Perhaps the best that could be done here, or one way forward, again, a big research agenda, is to narrow down the set of amendments that one studies and focus on those for which it is possible to estimate demand on the basis of, say, public opinion surveys or other things where a conjecture about demand can be more convincingly made. So, for example, right now, we know there are some issues in the air about, the legalization of, these, I don't even know if these are constitutional issues, right? So that's part of the problem. For example, one could say that in the U.S. there has been constant demand for overturning some Supreme Court decisions, right? But I don't know how one would do that, would go from there to really stating, well, there's demand for this, and that kind of amendment. Okay. All right. The next issue that I think is about this concept of amendment culture. I like the concept very much, but I would also like to know better what it is about. So I think there's scope for theoretical, conceptual elaboration. What is this amendment culture? So Barry Weingast, in a famous paper, talks about how there is an unspoken norm, or maybe it's a spoken norm, but it's an informal norm where he conjectures that if a government violates the U.S. Constitution, for example, then the public will know that there was a violation, and expecting everybody else to rebel, expecting others to rebel, any individual will find it in his or her interest to actually rebel against a government that transgresses the Constitution. So that's one way to think about amendment culture. Maybe not the best way, but there has been some thought about norms and how that affects behavior with respect to constitutions. What exactly is amendment culture? Now, that of course is again another. I think is amenable to more elaboration, but empirically speaking, so I would like to go back to the paper, and so the way that it's measured right now, it's of course it's very difficult to measure. So this is a first attempt. So what they do is they say, well, how often has the Constitution been amended before? That should reflect the amendment culture, and I think that is to some extent correct. So anything we observe will reflect amendment culture if that's actually an influence on amendments. The problem with this measure is that it's also reflecting all other influences on past amendments, which include all institutional influences and all amendments, demand for amendments. So how do you sort these out? So I think a better first step that could be taken now with the data that they have is to simply estimate amendment culture as a residual. So any amendments that I observe took place that I cannot explain with institutional variables or with demand variables, then I could conjecture, well, this is the unexplained part is the culture. Now, it could be that there's other things that are constituting this unexplained part, but at least I think that would be at least you would be taking out all these explanations that you already know about and have measures from the measure. And actually, this could be done, say, for example, for every decade, using the information you have until that decade. Then you can calculate the residual right then, and then you have an estimate of the amendment culture up to that point. Then you can use that as an input in some other regression, perhaps, or at least you know the size of this residual. It's an upper bound, perhaps, on the direct effect of culture. Of course, culture could also work indirectly through the institutions, right, or through the demand, and it likely does. So disentangling this is sort of thorny. Another avenue that I think might be promising here is to even if nobody has done a survey asking specifically, well, do you like your constitution to be amended, or do you think it's a good idea, or things like that? If there were more elaboration of what the amendment culture consists of or where it comes from, then you could say, well, I believe that people who do not trust their governments or do not trust their judiciaries are likely to be less inclined to support any sort of tampering with the Constitution. Or I believe that in countries where there's more contentious politics, perhaps ethnically divided societies, then people might be more distrustful of amendments of a Constitution, which might end up serving one party at the expense of another. So I think there's ways, upon more further elaboration of this concept, to actually use survey data or even demographic data or whatever there is that might impinge on this concept of constitutional culture and use that as a proxy. Okay. Those are my big comments. I have a few small comments, and then I think we're going to have a lot of time for questions. So, okay. So the first one, Tom already preempted. The measure they have, which is already a huge step forward. They actually know how many provisions in a constitution changed after it was amended. You can imagine the kind of data collection that's required for that. But of course, as they acknowledge in the paper as well, some very small amendments could have a huge impact on the political life of a country, and other very lengthy amendments could be basically inconsequential. So this measure takes into account, it reminds me of the literature on education, where they always measure the amount of education, but of course everybody knows the quality of education matters too, but that's very difficult to measure. So then we stick with the amount of education, right? But here I think what Tom suggested would be a great idea. Just substantively code the changes, and then forget about the proportion of the size of the changes as a proportion of the total number of provisions, but look at really the impact on specific substantive issues and how far the amendment goes. That's a huge undertaking, just that by itself. All right, now a very technical comment. I think that another thing you could do in addition to what you would do in the paper is to estimate your coefficients on the basis of overtime variation within countries. That would be in some ways more convincing, but it would require that you create a dependent variable that actually varies over time. Otherwise, you can only do a cross-sectional analysis, but you could do a panel analysis. I think one way to create that variable would be, instead of averaging the total amendments over the total time, you could do a moving average of, say, 5 years or 10 years. Then you have overtime variation in the rate of amendments. And we know that it's likely that the rate of amendments has changed over time, especially in very old constitutional systems, as again the paper states. And then finally, an open question that I thought was very interesting, and again touches on the normative part of things. So the paper gives arguments both for why constitutional stability might be enhanced by flexibility, by making amendments easy, right? So if society is out of step with the Constitution, then making amendments difficult might mean that the Constitution becomes less relevant and more brittle, etc. So that's pointed out in the paper. At the same time, making amendments too easy perhaps also contributes to some kind of it's clearly a source of constitutional instability, right? So, what is the desirable thing, and in terms of the relevance of the Constitution. Anyway, that's
Great.
That's what I have.
Yes, John. Yeah.
I just wanted to.
Yeah, you can be heard.
I wanted to extend one question of Alberto's, which was the measure of culture you use was this lag-dependent variable, and I think it would be useful if in Table 2, which is your regression results, you had a column that indicated what happened when you left it out. Because suppose it were the case that these amendment rules actually make a difference, then insofar as there's stability in the patterns, they'll make a difference on the lag-dependent variable as well, and you'll very likely wipe out the results in all the other columns. So now I don't know for a fact what the data would look like if you inserted that column, but it would be very useful for the reader to see it. And I don't, anyway, so that's just one comment. The second comment is this, which is if you look at American history, which I know is not a model for anything, but if you look at what I would call intuitively the important amendments, they more or less happen in two periods following a huge destabilizing event. First, the adoption of the Constitution, which was deeply unpopular among much of the nation, right? And it provoked the offering of 350 proposed amendments to the Constitution during the ratification process, right? In the Bill of Rights, the first actually proposed 12 amendments, 10 of which were ratified immediately, one of which much later. That was, an attempt to deal with this huge shift in the status quo away from what close to a majority of the country preferred. In the second substantive change to the American Constitution that was substantial was post-Civil War. Again, a huge shift in the status quo. After that, we barely amend anything. So I would say one thing you should pay attention to is when there's a huge shift in the status quo, a destabilization, especially if it's adopted by pointy-headed intellectuals and lawyers, it's very likely they get it wrong. That's going to generate a huge demand right then, a spike. So that's the second question. The third point is I don't know if culture is meant to be, or demand, let's say culture and demand both. All right, so I don't know if they're meant to be purely local concepts or global concepts. So I look at your graph, the graph over time about amendments. They're going up like mad, right? Not just in Mexico, but across the country, so across the world. Many places are getting more and more amendments. Why is that? Is it peculiar idiosyncratic features of this country and that country? Or is it globally issues are put on the table? Human rights, let's call it for a moment, is one big category. It's all the rage. Constitutions have to come to grips with human rights. It's not a local fact. I mean, it's partly a local fact. There has to be receptivity locally, but it's not just local. It's that you can't have a modern constitution without coming to grips with human rights. So that could be understood as a demand idea, or it could be understood as a kind of global legal culture idea. That is to say that part of what it is to have a modern constitution is to have certain provisions. So I would say I don't have a way to operationalize that in your system, but it seems like that is a phenomenon, and it's going to be hard to understand like that graph without really taking it seriously. Now, I think this could help you think about demand, because one source of demand is the intellectual class, the juridical, intellectual legal scholar class, legal judges, come to this idea that we have to have certain rights that are not in many constitutions yet, or should be, and they become circulated. So then that could generate demand, or you could understand it as a substantive cultural set of demands. I don't know which way the category is, but it could go either way. But I think there is a global versus local issue on one or both of those, and you don't really address it, but it might be useful, right? So anyways, that's what I had to say.
Good.
Yes, works. No, in any event, I can speak loud. So it seems to me there are two questions. One, how to measure, and then why to measure. So how to measure, Tom says something very important in his paper, but you don't use this observation, and that has been made by Alberto also. So the American Constitution is famously very difficult to modify, and you may know or may not know that one of the easiest constitutions to modify is the Italian one. But the rate of amendment of the Italian Constitution is lower than the one of the Italian Constitution has my age. So in 67, 68 years has been modified once. So much less than the American Constitution. Why? Because the political system is extremely fragmented and they disagree about everything. So you cannot easily find even 51%. 51% is enough. But you cannot find 51% to amend the Constitution. But the second point is, to me, much more important, because I'm interested in why to measure and not in how to measure, because I'm not able to measure. So I read what people write about measurement, but I'm interested in why people measure that rather than that. So I want to give advice to those who measure, because I cannot do it. So the question is the following: why we want to measure the amendment difficulty? I think there is a good reason, which presupposes some constitutional philosophy, meaning that we agree with the founding fathers, American, that we want to create counter-majoritarian constitutions, system which cannot be modified by the majority. So we want, like Hamilton said, a limited government. We have to agree about that. And moreover, if we agree about that, I think we have to add that such a constitution we want to protect has to be a constitution which has been established by a large coalition of political actors. Because if the constitution is imposed to the society by one section of the society, it's not a good idea to entrench it, and it's impossible. Think of the history of the Latin American Constitution. Why these Latin Americans change the Constitution so often? Not because they are crazy, but because the Constitution was unilaterally imposed, to use a concept of Andrea. So the next majority, since the Constitution froze the political preferences of this group, he's obliged to change it or largely to amend. So we want to stabilize non-unilateral constitutions. And then John is right. Inevitably, if there is a big shift in the Italian constitution, again to speak of something I know a little bit, is now probably going to be modified, because the agreement which was at the origin 68 years ago doesn't exist anymore. The two political actors which wrote the Constitution do not exist anymore. There is no Christian Democratic Party, not Communist Party. So there is a big social, political transformation. So the Constitution has to be modified. But in any event, I think that, the question is that my question is that we have to clarify why we want to measure these difficulty of amendment. And there are cases where, in my opinion, is good to have difficulties, and cases where it's not good. So, I mean, if we don't know that, why we are measuring everything? I mean, I don't care about the stability of the Brunei constitution. Brunei has a constitution. Yeah. Well, because it's a quasi-fascist system. And I have some political opinion. There are people who are neutral. Good for them. Good if you believe them. I don't believe them. So I have some political ideas about my research project. I hope that I'm not doing my research badly, which is a different thing. I might be stupid, and even if I have good political idea, my research is crap. But I would distinguish these two things. So that's my point.
Tom, would you like to answer these two?
I do have some
or
answers.
We continue?
Maybe I can say a little now, because
Okay.
actually it's
Yes.
three with Alberto.
And then we will take another.
Exactly. So I have so many things I want to say, so I'll try to not say too much here. So maybe I'll just start with Pasquale. Why measure? Well, as you know, as actually the three of us are actually interested in constitutions and authoritarian regimes, and one might want to look at them precisely to understand why. One of our findings, I think, or the collective findings in this area, is that constitutions are good for authoritarian regimes. It helped the PR to coordinate, and that's generally true. Authoritarian regimes that adopt constitutions last longer than those that don't. So, but again, that leads to the normative, and I think then you'd be comfortable with the normative suggestion I was making. Let's think about what's the democratic core of the Constitution, and then, of course, I need an external theory for that. Maybe you'll help provide me with that. But if I can identify that, then that would at least allow me to focus on why we're measuring it. Now, thank you, John, for the comments on the running without the lagged dependent variable. That's important to do. It's interesting. I mean, I'm just going to say a little about the United States experience because it's one that I know somewhat well, which is if you think about it, yes, we do have these major pushes after great destabilizing events, but we also have periods where there seems to be demand for amendment or an amendment culture. A political movement will have a culture of amendment, and that's the progressive era. They had a lot of constitutional amendments. Then there's no amendments. During the civil rights era, there's no amendments, really. It's rather interesting that they didn't think that. Well, that's very late, but yes, that's the one. But all the Brown versus Board, all that's done another way. Now we're in an era where we're seeing, I think, some demand for amendment. The citizens from both the left and right, the Citizens United people, the people who don't like it, like me, but then also the right wing. There's this Fox News commentators calling for us to have a new constitutional convention to get rid of Obama and American fascism, as they see it. So there's something in the air now. So there's something really in the air, and I think again, really tough to measure. But demand has changed over time. In the United States, we've had 9,000 proposals for amendments since 1900. 9,000 proposed in Congress. But many of those, as you suggested, aren't real. They're just some politicians saying, yeah, I'm going to take down abortion with this proposed constitutional amendment, parentheses, I know it has no chance in hell, but I get some points. And so you're trying to distinguish the real ones. Now, maybe what we could do is look at the ones that pass a House of the Legislature or something. Say those are the real baseline for calculating the batting average of constitutional reform success. Maybe we could do something like that. It might be hard to get that data across nationally, but I appreciate the suggestion. And I really like the global culture thing. All right, one or two other things, and then I'll turn it back to all of you. Let's see, sorry. So the political configuration, obviously that matters in theory, but we've got that Hennish variable in here. Political constraints, which purports to measure the de facto sort of number of parties that can influence policy. So I think we get at some of that. We're controlling for some of that. But that is, of course, the crucial thing. That's why, in principle, you can't have a optimal amendment rule because it always depends on the local political configuration. And Pasquale's story about Italy reflects it. Yeah. At the same time, Zach and I, in our book, have what we think is an optimal level of amendment difficulty for constitutional endurance. So on average, we think Constitution should be relatively flexible but not simple majority. The India rule seems to be right to provide that's the statistical result. And so we're able to do that. Again, it's just an average. You don't want to apply that in any particular context. I think I'll stop here because I know there's a lot of other questions.
Hector?
I have the mic.
Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much. I think Tom and Alberto may be happy to hear that we've done twice here in Mexico a national survey on constitutional culture. Well, we didn't try to analyze this concept of amendment culture, which is new to me, but I find it very plausible. And of course, we asked people about their opinions about changing the Constitution. Do you think that the existing Constitution is adequate for the needs of the country or not? And many people say no. So they have an expectation that the Constitution will change. And I have somehow the impression that if people perceive that the Constitution is amended very frequently, they may have the idea that there's something is wrong with the Constitution. So if they change it so frequently, it is because it needs to be changed. So they have this expectation that it should be changed as frequently as needed until we have the optimal Constitution. I don't know what that is, but maybe this is the expectation. And in Argentina and Costa Rica, they did a survey similar to ours with some of the same questions. So it might be interesting to look again at this surveys, 4 surveys actually, and see if we can extract from the questions and the answers some ideas about the amendment culture. Okay. Thank you.
Anel?
Thank you, Andrea. Do I need a mic?
Yeah, there is a mic.
Thank you. Well, I have one question, and is that if in measuring amendments, either the quality of the amendments or the amount of the amendments, should we take into account the role of the judicial control of the Constitution? In countries where we seem to have a very active judiciary, even with a very, and I have to say that what I sort of know, it's Mexico and the United States because I study there. But then you could say you have a very similar amendment clause, but the rate of change is very different. So I was thinking if the judiciary has something to do with it. When you have a judiciary that is very active in interpreting the Constitution and adapting the Constitution to social demands, and very classical themes like Brown versus Board of Education, Roe versus Wade, will say with the same Constitution you really had a very big change in the interpretation of what the Constitution is protecting. When you do not have this, and maybe the Mexico experience in the 20th century it represents this, when you have a very timid judiciary that tends not to go into these big questions, then you have a lot of demands in changing the Constitution because it doesn't answer to the social demands, the social changes. And then you require for the Constitution to be changing because the interpretation of the Constitution does not make these changes or adaptations to the social demands.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I have just three brief comments. One on how to, as Hector was saying, using this service, also Alberto mentioned it. We have in Mexico this the survey on the constitutional culture, and also the World Values Survey. I mean, they don't ask the question about what do you think about amending the Constitution, or do you think it's necessary, but maybe something like getting at how do they think about political authorities, or how much do they value legal stability, or something like that can just be helpful for to pin down empirically the concept. Another question is also small, like a suggestion. I think the Hennis's measure on political constraints has some good features, but is very restrictive in the sense that it's like categorical, is not very good, and a simple interaction between the number of actors that the Constitution establishes for passing an amendment interacted with the effective number of legislative parties. That, I mean, it can capture Pasquale, like Italy's situation, Mexico's situation, when you have one party controlling all the chambers. Probably that may be helpful. And one last point on the next step of coding substantively the amendments. My intuition is that if you separate, say, two simple things, the organic part of the Constitution and the dogmatic, rights and the rules of the political game, the rights wouldn't be amended that much. I mean, the amendments on the normative part, you just add rights. But there are usually no amendments to rights. So simply additions to the Constitution. Whereas the political rules of the game, the organic part, that changes. So the powers of the president, the powers of Congress, the electoral rules. So there, and that is different, right? Because there you change the rules every time, not simply adding things. So I don't know if that, like add something, but just wanted to make the comment.
So, okay, so just to say a couple of things. The World Values Survey, it's an interesting idea. There's this thing called the World Justice Project, and which is asking 1,000 people in 99 countries. And Zach and I actually got them to ask about constitutions. So we are starting to get data. It'll take a couple of years before that comes, but we'll have some cross-national stuff. I was kind of interested in your study, and I'll ask you afterwards if you have information on how the variation by state and locality within Mexico, because that'd be a very interesting source of variation given your federal system. Now, I wanted to say something about the how we might get it. Judicial control. Sorry, that's what Helen asked. So we do have this kind of typology. There it is. So if you think about it, there's combinations. You might think simply, in the United States, most people think these things are substitutes. We can't amend the Constitution, so we go for courts. But that's true in the United States, but we have many examples of countries where both the courts and amendment are frequently used, and this typology kind of does it. So you have amendment culture of constitutional amendment being flexible or rigid, judicial review being activist or restrained. United States is in the upper right, rigid amendment culture, but big courts do everything. Mexico maybe now is in the upper left with India and Brazil, where you're doing both. But Mexico to 2000 was in the lower left, right? It was just everything was in Parliament. And Japan doesn't use either one.
Right.
So what do we say? That's what is driving that? It's got to be something latent in something in the society which is determining what is the proper role of courts, how much can they do, and so.
Judicial culture.
Yeah, well, that's right. Well, that's within the courts, I guess you'd say. So we do think about that, and of course, there's a judicial review variable in this, and it's correlated positively with amendment rate in our study. So, on average, countries are more like Mexico and India, and less like the United States. The other thing I was thinking as we've been talking is what we really need is kind of a common shock. You have countries with different institutional arrangements, and they all receive a common shock. I'm not sure this would work, but maybe one is the financial crisis. And there have been this plethora of amendments tying the legislators' hands with regard to the budget. 3% limits, the European Union sort of demanded that. So maybe we could use the time it took for countries to adopt that as a variable, or just look at the actual politics within the countries to see if we could get anything from that, given that they all suddenly face this new demand. So that controls for demand, right? And then what you'd be isolating is and we know about institutions, we control for demand. The residual there would be something about culture, I suppose, or maybe attitudes toward the European Union. But looking for those kind of things, I think, will be helpful.
Juan?
Hi, part of what I have to say has already been said, so I think the points will be a bit trivial. So the first is I still think the pairing of the constitutional amendment rules with the political configuration is very important. You said you are controlling for some of that, but I think it's still very important because that is partly an institutional feature, right? Partly it could be cultural, political, part of the political culture, but I think it's really, really important. So the second thing I want to say is, if we believe in this thing called amendment culture, what's the mechanism? I'm curious to know more about the mechanism. Could be either of two things. If the culture is strong, you are less willing to propose an amendment, or you are less willing, if you are a legislator, for instance, to pass it. And this could be because you are not interested, because you don't think it's necessary, because out of respect for an original bargain, for instance. Sometimes people cite the Spanish case, right? The Moncloa Pact, stay alive, and part of the reason is, well, there was sort of a bargain among the main parties. So the Constitution reflects that pact, and we don't touch it, right? As long as we don't touch it, it's okay. And another possible mechanism is veneration, right? Madison's idea of if you start meddling with the Constitution, people would get the idea that it's really, really faulty, so you don't mess with the Constitution. So which one, or maybe you have other ideas of this so-called, we can call the mechanisms, is at play here for you. So the last question is, I know there's only so much you can do, and I think you touch upon this in the introduction to your endurance book, but about amendments outside the process, the formal process. And I'm thinking of David Strauss' contribution on the relevance of Article 5. I'm thinking of super statutes or judicial interpretations about the Constitution. Or I'm also thinking of this difference between an amendment that only reflects a change already operated in society or the political culture, or an amendment that is aimed at changing, right, something in society. There seems to be a big difference between those two things. Yeah. In the first case, well, the amendment is kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, and that's what Strauss says, of course. Right. Look, I mean, we're not going to. I don't think we can possibly look at. I don't think you've looked at super statutes in a cross-national sense. There's no data on it, and small c constitutional change obviously is what's really driving the coordination function in society. So, we're really maybe trying to be modest in the sense of just going back to that original motivation. You guys are sitting around drafting a constitution, and someone asks you, well, what should we do about the amendment rule? What should we do? And, you can just borrow randomly, or maybe we could try to advance things. Now, we haven't found much here yet. We haven't found much. But the motivation was to try to do it, and sometimes it's good to try things and see if you come up with stuff. And from that point of view, I think it's almost too complicated to get into the small c stuff. Well, you can't do it this way. Go for the legislature, So I go for the super statutes and all this other stuff. I'll talk to you later about mechanisms because I want to make sure I understand the distinction between your two that you offered.
You want to add something?
Well, I was going to. It's not on this point.
Okay.
I just wanted to get back in the queue because I have another point.
Okay, you can. I think you can do that.
just do it time?
And we have time just for.
Okay, this is just. I'm going to venture a technical suggestion that may be helpful. So your table 2, I would interpret them as a supply side model. So the idea is that supply is supposed to be on your theory more or less difficult depending on these institutional configurations. So in economics, as you know, demand can't be directly observed either. The only thing you observe is what happens, the transactions that happen where the supply and demand curve cross.
Yeah, true.
So what you've done is you've estimated supply side, supply function, but you haven't estimated demand function. So what does an economist do then? Well, they use a little theory. So they say, well, income should matter in demand. So the more money people have, the more they're going to want of everything. Let's say. So, but they put variables, I think, on. So they try to separate using usually simultaneous equation estimations to figure out the difference. So they're not in a very different situation than you. So many suggestions that have been made here have to do, at least in principle, with when there might be more demand, either specifically with respect to, let's say, rights, which I agree with Julio that rights come on the table, like say human rights ideas. So you might sort of say that when some convention gets ratified or treaties get signed, certain things are, whether you can observe it or not in a specific country, they're on the table as an idea to be recognized as they were done in the Mexican Constitution at a certain moment. Like, oh, these rights are there, we're signatories to these treaties. What status do they have in Mexican law? What happened in the Human Rights Act in Great Britain, 1998? There were these rights in the European Human Rights Convention. For a long time there was lobbying by judges, incidentally, to recognize those within British law. So then finally they do this. So you can sort of, that's a demand side argument, right? So you have little moments in time when they might come on the agenda, and it might be local, So you can think of other things like that. So for example, the thing I mentioned, which is a shock to the, a shock away from the status quo. Which could be from adopting a new constitution, but it could arise in some other way. Like Pasquale said, the disappearance of major political actors. That's a shock, right? So that should affect the demand for things. So what I'm saying is, and I don't have a way to do this, but if you could think separately about the demand function, from the supply function, and then just try in the stupidest possible way to use techniques used in estimating demand and supply functions in economics from I'm sure there's an intelligent way to do it too, but let's just do it the way economists do it. So it's a stupid way to do it. Then just do that and just see if you can tease out a separation between supply and demand. And that might, it's true you won't have measured anything exactly, but you might get some leverage on the data that you don't have now. So it's just, I'm not optimistic this will work, but it might be something.
Right.
And it would accommodate many of the comments around that.
I appreciate it. It's a good way to conceptualize it. My comment about looking for a common shock is one version of that as well. I think you're right.
Jose Maria, very fast. Last question. We are on, we don't have much time, so if you can be really brief.
Yes, I was just thinking of the implications of the conclusion of your paper on the proposal of reordering and making more compact the Mexican Constitution, the proposal that Pedro mentioned. Your conclusion is basically that institutions or institutional factors do not matter that much. It's most in the cultural and political side where you can find the explanation of why constitutions change in an accelerated way. So your conclusion creates doubts about the capacity of our proposal to stop the dynamic of hyper-reformism. One of the major concerns of this proposal is to stop that dynamic.
Yeah.
And you strongly suggest that we should look into this concept, which I also find very interesting, the amendment culture. When I read this concept in your paper, I immediately thought of law and development scholarship of the 60s and the 70s, which a literature that went very deep into this concept. They were trying to find, to explain the cultural factors that explain the legal systems of Latin America, and they were trying to see if changes in the legal system could impact on the levels of development of our societies. And I find this line very interesting. I don't know if you are planning to go deeper into it, because I think that in this concept lies the key to explain what is happening to our constitution. And I just very briefly mention three concepts that were proposed by law and development scholarship in order to explain the Latin, what they call the Latin American culture. Latin American culture is highly legalistic. Latin American culture is highly formalistic. And Latin American culture is characterized by paternalism. I will not go deeper into these concepts, but I think that in these three concepts you can find cultural factors, but maybe political factors that explain why political elites need to amend constitutions so often.
Great.
So, but really, 1 second, because we really are tight. Please, just.
I won't answer what you say.
Good morning. I have a question for you, Professor Ginsburg. I'm a PhD student here. I'm researching in China. Well, according to Confucian legal tradition, they state that the government has the duty to attend people's welfare. So, the current Chinese government has already taken 500 million out of poverty. So it seems that they have the mandate of heaven, and people is more or less happy with it, with the Communist Party and the government, except I would say like in places without a Confucian tradition, which is, for example, Xinjiang or Tibet.
Yeah.
So they are constructing the socialist legal system with Chinese characteristics. In last year's, in October 2014, in the fourth plenary session of the 18th Central Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party's leadership was not only not challenged, but it was recognized. So, setting aside evolutionary perspectives, do you think that there could be a legal modern form that does not resemble multiparty democracy? I.e., for example, a more professionalized judiciary without a real judicial independence, since also constitutionally there is not a division of powers in China. There is the recognition of one supreme power, this National Popular Assembly, Article 57, but also constitutionally recognized the Chinese Communist Party leadership.
I have 3 words. Viva la revolución. No. I would like to actually talk to you about it outside, because it's just too long to answer in this tight constraint. But but Pasquale and I were just debating this last night. We're all very interested in that question.
We want to organize
it's quite away from this panel, but let's talk about it afterwards.
Many thanks. So let's take like 2 minutes while Zach puts his presentation, and we'll be back.